Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar. My name is Don McLean. I am Chief Cybersecurity Technologist at DLT Solutions, and I am joined here today by Omar Rafiq, who is Managing Federal Sales Engineer at SolarWinds, and my colleague, Dr. Arun Vishwanath, who is an expert in the field of phishing and training to avoid phishing attacks. Omar, you want to just introduce yourself for a minute? Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Don. Again, my name is Omar Rafiq, and I'm the Federal Sales Engineering Manager for SolarWinds. I've been with SolarWinds for about 5 years, and I really enjoy working for SolarWinds, and I'm happy to be on this webinar.
Thanks, Omar. And my name is Don McLean, as I mentioned, and I have worked for DLT Solutions for about 4 years, and what we do is to accelerate public sector growth for technology companies. Prior to working for DLT, I worked most of my career for BAE Systems, and in that capacity, I ran cybersecurity programs at several different federal government agencies. Arun, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, thank you, Don. I'm Arun Vishwanath. I am Chief Technologist at Avant Research Group. I spent 15 years prior to that as a research professor at the University at Buffalo and at Harvard University. My expertise is in the people problems of cybersecurity.
Thanks, Arun. Let's take a look at the vast topic, the hack that keeps on giving, the insider threat. First of all, we want to realize that the insider threat is in fact a growing problem. It never seems to stop, and we'll see some statistics that corroborate that assertion. We'll look at two of the major types of insiders, which are the malicious insider and the careless and untrained insider. And that's where our colleague Dr. Vishwanath can speak at length. Then we'll look at how to respond to those issues of the insider threat. One is how the administration and legal landscape is responding, and then we'll also look at technological solutions and approaches to handling the insider threat. So first of all, we want to look at the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, a well-known, commonly referred, highly regarded report. And in that report, there were 360 breaches reported in the public sector. 51 of those breaches, or 16%, were from what they call privilege misuse, which is really just a euphemism for insider threat. That is, insiders using their privileges in a way that they should not be using them, either on purpose, for malicious purposes, or because they are simply careless and doing something that they didn't realize was wrong, but perhaps should have known better. SolarWinds also does a survey report, their Federal Cybersecurity Survey Report, and their statistics show that in 2014, 42% of the incidents were from careless and untrained insiders, but as we said earlier, it's a growing problem. By 2018, we're seeing that 56% of the insider threat are, in fact, from careless and untrained insiders. Malicious insiders account for more and more of the problem. As you can see here, it goes from 17% in 2014 on up to 36% in 2018. So whatever we're doing now, we need to take a closer look and come up with some more effective solutions. So Omar, what are some of the statistics that you have seen, and some of the ways that you have responded to the insider threat issue?
Yeah, thank you, Don. Well, I'd first like to mention that, as Don mentioned earlier, SolarWinds has been running this survey for the past 4 years. And the whole purpose of the survey was to learn about the primary cybersecurity threats facing federal agencies, the degree of cybersecurity readiness within the agency, and the top cybersecurity obstacles that agencies face. The study revealed, as Don mentioned earlier, that whether through human error or malicious intent, people are a highly unpredictable and significantly damaging threat to the agency's cybersecurity defense. As in the latest survey, as noted in this chart, the #1 threat that gave IT professionals in the federal government, both in DoD as well as civilian agencies, at the most sleepless nights, I should say, was insider threats due to lack of training and carelessness. As a matter of fact, as is noted on the slide and Don mentioned it earlier, there has been an increase over the past several years in the category of untrained and careless insider threats when respondents were asked, what are the greatest IT security threats to face your agency? Significantly more respondents note their ability to detect and prevent careless insider threats as a constant battle relative to malicious insider threats. More believe they have seen improvements or have malicious insider threats under control, despite the fact we see that small increase in that previous slide. Almost half the respondents believe lack of training contributes to insider threats. Most respondents also believe their agency data is most at risk on government-owned mobile devices, and a smaller percentage are concerned about employee or contractor-owned mobile devices. And of course, this will increase as agencies implement BYOD programs. Also, the increase in use of cloud apps and infrastructure is also one of the top reasons for malicious threats.
So let's take a look at these insiders that are posing this threat. As we mentioned earlier, there's two types of insiders, basically. The one is the adversarial or malicious insider, and the other is the careless, in either untrained user or user that perhaps has been trained but hasn't really absorbed their training or isn't using their training or putting it into practice, even though they have stepped through perhaps the training that has been given them and passed it, but they're just not really using it when they sit down at the workplace again. So what is the motivation of an adversarial or malicious insider? Well, number one, the thing that motivates us all, but presumably in a ethical and moral way, which is money. There can also be an ego motivation. I know that at the FBI there was an infamous insider named Hansen who really didn't make very much money at all. Over the course of 25 years, he sold secrets to the Russians, and over 25 years he made something like $250,000, which in one lump sum might be a certain amount, but really it's only $10,000 a year. He wasn't making much money on it. He did it because it gratified his ego simply to feel that he was putting one over on the FBI. And then also there can be an ideological motivation, someone who is working from the inside to undermine or an agenda or to promote an agenda that they want. Of course, we all know about Mr. Snowden and some other less infamous but still malicious insiders that have carried out their deeds. I personally was involved in a couple of insider threat incidents during my stay at one agency, which I don't want to speak about in detail because it's still confidential. But there were some pretty significant and immoral people that fortunately we were able to put behind bars through some surveillance and evidence collection methods that we used at this particular agency where I was working. One of them was involved in organized crime. The other was involved in, sadly, a child pornography ring. But the upside is we were able to catch them and put them behind bars. So I have been, unfortunately, up close and personal with some pretty malicious insiders. More prevalent, but perhaps less dangerous, or less unsettling, is the insider who is not, as I mentioned, is not carrying out their training or has not received proper training. Now, in most government agencies where I carried out cybersecurity or managed cybersecurity programs, training was mandatory. So the notion that someone is actually untrained is pretty unusual, but the notion, as Dr. Vishwanath will talk about, that someone has been trained but hasn't put it into practice is pretty common. There's also a pretty widespread culture that the training or that your security measures can be kind of an obstacle to getting work done. You just want to get through that training. You just want to finish that video or that slide deck or that whatever training is being classroom training and get back to work. As a consequence, the training is often insufficient, either because the training itself isn't that substantial and doesn't really give the users what they need to know, or the training is simply absorbed but forgotten as soon as the user gets back to the desk, or maybe they remember it, but they're just, we all get caught up in the hectic nature of our work day to day, and they forget to put it into practice. By far the most common area or the attack vector where we see careless and untrained users having an ill effect is through phishing attacks. It's very, very common for users to continue to click on phishing emails and to open phishing documents attached to a phishing email, open a URL that's in an email, and then before you know it, they've been compromised. Even high-level officials can be prone to this. I'm not going to name the official, but when I was in the government, I worked with one particular CISO who did just this. So it's easy to overlook. There's an issue with this, and the question, of course, is how prevalent is it? Well, we can see some of the attacks that are targeting the public sector. We see a lot of cyber espionage. There is privilege misuse, which is really the insider threat. As I mentioned earlier, that's 51 out of the 306 or so attacks. And we also see a lot of phishing attacks. If you look over on the right, you see the biggest bar is the phishing problem. And on the left, the third biggest bar is privilege misuse, which is a more generic form of the insider threat problem. Whoops, pardon me. Now, in addition to being prevalent, there is also an issue with the dwell time. The dwell time is, as you see here, pretty significant. Although it's worse in other countries, it's still pretty bad in the Americas, and particularly in the public sector. These statistics, as you can see, come from FireEye from their Mandiant M-Trends report from 2018. So, in addition, the cost of training is getting higher and higher as well. We're seeing more and more money being spent on training, but the training itself is not that helpful. I'm going to hand this off, though, to the expert in the field of training and phishing attacks, and that is Dr. Arun Vishwanath. Arun, take it away.
Well, thank you, Don. We talked a little bit so far about all the various types of insider attacks, and one of the issues that I've been working on for the past almost 2 decades of my research career is on what I call unintentional insiders, and this is individuals who fall victim to phishing attacks, as we know. And when we look at the public sector right now, we look at the patterns in which this is happening. We notice that phishing attacks are still by far the most common vector that's used for cyber espionage within the public sector. Cyber espionage is something that we're seeing as the primary target. So almost 40% of all those attacks, 35 to 40% of those attacks that are coming on, that are being targeted, that are targeting the public sector are espionage. And when we look within espionage, how this is happening, you notice that almost 80-90% of them are phishing attacks. And of course, this is because just the scale, the volume, and just the ability to go after individuals in large email dumps continues to be a problem. Of course, there are other ways in which it's happening, but in this particular case, social media, messaging, and email-based phishing seems to be the primary vectors that has been used. And this is the Verizon 2018 report from which I'm getting this data. So the other issue that comes about with phishing is also something that's important, is the idea of dwell time. And when we look at the dwell times, again, this is particularly a problem when it comes to cyber espionage. It's the fact that when the bad guys are in the system, if they get through a phishing attack and they get access to a system, once they have access to the system, the dwell times that we're looking at has not improved a lot. So if you look at the Americas right now, the dwell time on average is about 75 days. So this is the number of days. And if you look at the Americas, it's about 75 days. So that's close to 3 months that the bad guys are able to sit in the system before they are discovered. I mean, it's a lot worse when you look at the Asia Pacific region, which is the APAC in the last part of that slide. This is the Europeans. In the European Union, for instance, you're seeing 175 days on average. And then, if you look at the global data, we're still looking at upwards of 3 months when you accumulate this. So what the dwell time tells us is the so-called unintentional insider may click on a phishing attack or a phishing link once, but the bad guy from there on now sits in the system for upwards to 3 months. And when they're sitting in the system for upwards to 3 months, I mean, there is a lot of data that they can download or wreak havoc with. So this is a concern, because when we look at insiders on one end and the way they operate, and we look at the unintentional insider, we never recognize how big an issue that unintentional insider, that one person clicking on a malicious link can be. And just a one person clicking on a link could result in a damage that could go on for months and sometimes years in certain regions. So this is one of the reasons why we talk about phishing as continuing to be a huge problem. And what we're looking at, and this 2018 data, when we compare it with other data from 2017 and 2016, and some of the data has been trended over time, when we look at this, these numbers have not gotten any better. Back in 2016, we were looking at 82 days on average. So really, in the 3 years after spending millions of dollars in all manner of proactive, technological, as well as human-focused, user-focused interventions, that fall in dwell time has been very marginal. And if you look at it from a statistical standpoint, it's not been significant. And here, this is a research piece that was done by a couple of researchers from RAND, and this was an estimation between 2015 and say 2025 on what we're spending and how much these spends are going up in order to meet some of these, insider as well as unintentional insider attacks, in order to protect against them. And when we look at some of this data, what's really stark about it is that the training costs have been the ones that have been going up dramatically. And we were looking at this, this was this is a 2015 paper, and the estimates for 2019, we're right on target when it comes to these estimates. So when we look at, at the macro level, people are training a lot more, especially in the federal government. We're mandated training in many cases, and the training costs are going so much higher than even the cost of an attack. So if you look at the attack costs, the bad guys, they're not facing any more or any less of a challenge as yet. And if you look at the losses from the cyber attacks, those losses are actually a trend, whereas when you look at training today, the estimates are that is going to far surpass even the losses from a cyber attack. So I'm going to talk a little bit about training, because that is outside of the technical interventions that have been put into place. Training continues to be the primary proactive approach, and perhaps the most expensive, and likely to be the most expensive in the years to come, in the next decade or so, way of dealing with this idea of unintentional insiders. So one of the couple of things we've talked about so far, right? Number one is unintentional insiders, as in phishing, who are compromised through phishing, is a big problem. Number two, the problem is growing. Number three, the problem and the dwell times have not reduced, nor have the costs of doing these kind of things reduced, and if anything, the costs are going up. So some of the work that I have done in my research is to estimate the value of this training, right? So why we know the training costs are going up, and one of the reasons the training costs are going up is because more people are getting trained, and every organization, especially in the federal government, is training people, training their users, and sometimes repeatedly. So in my research, what I wanted to do was see, okay, how effective is this training in protecting us from this unintentional insider? In other words, how effective is it in stopping someone from accidentally clicking on a link or knowingly entering a credential on a web page that they should not have entered it in? So part of what I've done in my research is look to see how well this works. So here is a company that volunteered to participate in my study, and what we did in this particular case is, this is a company that had about a few thousand employees. It's a for-profit company working in the financial sector. It has offices all over the country, and what we did in this particular case is sent all of them. The company did a training process. It's a one-time training, so it's an intensive training where all employees were trained how to fish, how to recognize a fish, how to not get fished, and all that. And half of the employees were not trained. And then at the end of this, 2 to 3 month training process, where every month they had some coursework online as well as in a classroom type setting, we basically sent everybody a phishing attack, just one attack over a period of 1 week. And what we realized, and what we found, was that the training effects were very marginal, right? So the unintentional insider in this case was just as likely to be a trained person as a person who was not trained. And if you look at these percentages, like 32% and 35%, the people who were trained and they were not trained. So one of the conclusions you get from this is that training alone, especially that long, detailed training that some organizations are increasingly starting to do, where they're spending a lot of time in multiple protocols training them, doesn't seem to work, or at least doesn't seem to work as well. Okay, and you might as well not train them and get the same results in this particular case. So the other thing that we wanted to look at was the other form of training, which is what I like to call as embedded training, right? This is training people repeatedly, right? And this is done through phishing penetration tests, right? This is common in most armored agencies right now, where you send people a fake or simulated phishing attack, and you check to see how many people clicked, and if they have clicked, whether they have clicked for why, basically trying to say, does the training work? And if they click, there's like a splash page just opens up, and we ask people, to look and see, okay, the aspects of the training or the phishing email that they did not recognize. So here's something that we did with a company where this is a federal government agency where everybody was getting trained repeatedly. And they were getting trained over a 2 to 3 year period. In this particular case, this is at the 2 year mark where we did the study. This data is from 2 years. When at the end of 2 years, these guys had been repeatedly, given phishing penetration tests, simulated phishing attacks over a 2 year period. And this was probably about 20 to 25 different simulations that they had already gone through. At the end of those 20 to 25 simulations, my team basically created a simulated attack of our own, something that we had developed, and then we used this to see, okay, what percentage of the people are getting phished and what are not. Now, ideally, in this kind of an organization, you would expect nobody to get phished. What we ended up finding was 14% of the people got phished. So this is after 2 years of repeated pen tests. So think about it this way. In the previous case, long-term training, 35% got phished. Repeated 2 years, simulated attacks, 14% got phished. Now keep in mind that from an unintentional insider point of view, you just need one person. And in this particular case, we had about 5 individuals who got phished or fell for our attack repeatedly. In other words, we did this attack, the same attack, on a Monday, on a Wednesday, on a Friday, and these people would click on a Wednesday, on a Friday, or a Monday, on a Friday. So this is kind of bizarre behavior from people, but we see this a lot more than people realize. In other words, if I'm a bad guy out there, having a user who's trained fall for a fish is also actually pretty high. This is one of the reasons why, when we look at some of these 2018 data trends and go back 2015, 2016, what have you, we're looking at these trends of phishing being used as one of the primary vectors, not going down. And the reason it's not going down is because it works, and the bad guys know that it does. So the next question is, what do we do about these kind of things? And one of the things that I advocate is going beyond just trying to train without understanding the user. And this is the primary focus of my work, and I've written extensively about it. I've published papers on this, of course, in the academic world, as well as had presentations at places like Black Hat, where I've kind of talked about what it is that we know about them. And here's where it becomes important to understand the user. And what do I mean by understand the user? Part of what's going on right now is most of what we try to do with unintentional insiders, and even with insiders, is we presume that we understand the reasons for it. And therefore, when you look at phishing today, we train them by thinking that we know why they fall, therefore we know how to train them. And nothing is further from the truth, right? What we have found in my research is that there are different reasons why somebody falls for a phishing attack. So for instance, in this particular case, people may fall, become an unintentional insider, click on a malicious link because of the way they're thinking about something, or because they're distracted by using a different device, or by the notifications they're getting on their screen as they're doing things, or because they were looking at the wrong things, or we trained them to look at certain things that the bad guys were able to pull off. there are certain beliefs that people use, and these beliefs are important. So, for instance, just to give you an example, if you go around asking people, among your workers, your users rather, you ask them, hey, what do you think is more secure? Is it a Word document or a PDF document? And more often than not, everybody says a PDF is more secure. And then when you ask them why they think it's more secure, you're going to get to understanding something very critical about how people think. They're going to say, hey, you know what? I can't edit a PDF, which means I think the bad guys can't put malware on it or edit it. And this tells you how users think. Many people, even people who are trained in some technology, as you want to call it, have biases about operating systems. They have biases about certain browsers being more secure. And there's different reasons why they come up with these ideas. Some of these reasons are formed because they talk to somebody, or some of it is based on their own experiences in this particular case. And this is one of the things the bad guys out there are able to leverage, and this is something you need to understand. So when we start training our users with a pen test, for instance, we're ignoring why it is that they're falling for it. And until you know why it is they're falling for it, it's hard to build defenses around it. So one of the things that I'm advocating, that I've talked about extensively, written about as well, is what we need to do when it comes to untrained users. For one, not presume that training works and that all training is the same training. Everybody needs training. They need certain forms of training. Second, the idea of a careless user is not universal. Not every user is careless. Some of them are actually making very defined decisions that they're going to repeatedly do because they don't understand, or they think of something in a way which is incorrect. So part of what we need to do is identify those factors. We got to identify if it's a distraction. We got to meet those distractions. So we got to roll those distractions. If it is how they're thinking, we got to change the way they're thinking. And if it is what they're thinking, then we need to change what it is that they're thinking. Now, of course, this is a little bit more detailed than just saying, hey, let's all just make people do training for hours on end, or let's continuously, phish them and keep doing that. And what we have found, and there's a lot more data here that I'm presenting, is when you keep doing these kind of things, where you keep phishing them and keep telling them, hey, I can't believe you fell for it, what it actually does is actually reduces your overall use of email, for instance. People stop clicking on and opening on pretty much anything. And there is a cost to that we never look in. So when we look at these estimates of what's the cost of training, what's the cost of an attack, we forget that there's a cost of not using technology as well. So we don't want to get down that road either. We got to find that healthy medium, and that healthy medium can come only if we start going away from just this silver bullet, one shot, one type of training, to something more focused on the end user. And the closest analogy to that I think of is the medical field, right? I mean, today the way we do training is like every time you go to a doctor, the doctor just gives you some pill without even asking you what is wrong with you. And every time you go back, he gives you another pill, and it's the same pill, and he keeps giving it to you. And then at the end of the day, if the pill doesn't work, he's blaming you for not taking enough of it or not doing it the right way. That's the training paradigm that we're in. And part of what I'm advocating here is a need to change that. And the need to change that is by understanding our users. We already have a good understanding of what it is that the users need. Now we need to build defenses around those. So incorporating that into our training program, into our training protocols, incorporating an understanding into them, and then coming up with an assessment of overall risk is a much more personalized, dynamic way of thinking about the problem than what we're doing right now. All right. So who gets trained? How do they get trained? How often do they get trained? Even who gets access? Once we understand what it is that's the weakness at the end user level, or what is it that they're susceptible to, we can either restrict access, we can give access, we can take away access, or we can improve the access, the ability of the people who has access to be able to understand, hey, here are the weaknesses that we're seeing. Here are the reasons that you're clicking on this repeatedly, or you're susceptible to these forms of attack. And this is something we want you to watch out for, right? Understanding that. And at the IT level, at the CISO level, understanding who is the weak link, understanding why they're the weak link is invaluable when it comes to protecting the enterprise and to build cyber resilience. So it's one thing to say, hey, we're training our users. It's another thing to say, hey, you know what, our users are well trained. And there's a huge gap between those two perspectives. One is just doing it, and the other is trusting your users. And to get that trust, you got to get through this process. All right? Don, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Arun. That's a very enlightening discussion of the phishing problem and as a subcomponent of the overall insider threat. So clearly then, we have a problem with the insider threat. It's a growing problem, it's prevalent, the dwell times are too high. What can we do about this? Well, we need to approach it from two perspectives. One, through regulations, or more broadly an administrative approach, and then, as I mentioned earlier, through technological approaches. First of all, we've seen that Executive Order 13587 was promulgated in 2011, and it establishes the National Insider Threat Task Force, or NITTF. And its mandate was to analyze the continuing insider threat challenges facing the U.S. government. We're seeing some motion on that recently with the promulgation of maturity frameworks and so on. There is also, they have also put out an insider threat competency resource guide in 2017 that speaks to how to conduct operations to ensure that you can identify and deal with insiders, how to counsel the stakeholders, the relevant people on insider threat incidents should they occur, how to establish policies, procedures, and awareness training, there's that word again, to identify and bring to light insider threats should they arise, and how to evaluate programs for identifying and dealing with insider threats, responding to insider threats, to manage resources appropriately for that. I remember when I was dealing with the insider threat issue that I had to work with, the big issues were, number one, we had to make sure that we could have legal authority to do surveillance on the suspected insiders, even though they had signed agreements saying that they acknowledged that their computers could be under surveillance. We nonetheless got appropriate clearance from legal counsel to go ahead and do that surveillance. Number two, we had to make sure that whatever surveillance software we put in place was completely secret and would not tip off the suspect to the fact that they were in fact under surveillance. And number three, as we gathered evidence, we had to make sure that we could demonstrate adequate chain of custody, that only the right people had had access to the evidence we collected, and that we could prove that we had not altered or manipulated or polluted the evidence in any way, so that it would be, in fact, acceptable in a courtroom, court admissible. And in fact, it was. As I mentioned, we were eventually successful, although it's a long and arduous process to do that. The ODNI has also put out a maturity framework regarding insider threat, but that's coming from that came out only recently in November of 2018. They talk about how to monitor users and what kind of analysis and response you can do with the information and surveillance information that you might have collected. So Omar, what are some best practices, though, from a more technological perspective, although you could also speak to administrative issues, on how to combat an insider threat?
Well, thank you, Don. The basic function of an insider threat program is to protect the assets that provide your organization with a competitive advantage. For instance, a critical asset can be thought of as something of value that, if destroyed, altered, or otherwise degraded, would impact the confidentiality, integrity, or availability, and have a severe negative effect on the ability for the organization to support essential missions as well as business functions. By developing a formalized insider threat program, organizations can effectively detect, prevent, and respond to the unique threat from insiders. Now, the best time to develop a process for mitigating malicious insider incidents and the unintentional insider threat is, of course, before they occur, not as one is unfolding. But when an incident does occur, the process can be modified as appropriate based on post-mortem results from prior incidents. Now, an effective insider threat program collects and analyzes information from many different sources across the organization. As the number of data sources used for insider threat analysis increases, so too does an organization's ability to produce more relevant alerts and make informed decisions regarding potential insider activity. Now, the volume of data that must be collected, aggregated, correlated, and analyzed drives the need for the tools that can fuse data from different sources into an environment where alerts can be developed that identify actions indicative of potential insider activity. Of course, documenting and enforcing policies are critical to an overall insider threat policy, and including insider threat awareness into security training for employees is paramount. Now, this diagram may look familiar to some of you. It is really based on the cybersecurity framework. Organizations must identify those assets that we talked about earlier, and infrastructure, and ensure that implemented security controls are being adhered to, not only in the IT infrastructure, but also end-user policies are being abided by. They must also ensure that the controls and policies are effective and identify any vulnerabilities. There are various actions that you can take to control for risks. These range from avoiding the risky activity altogether to putting in place a policy to minimize the risk. We will now delve further into each of these categories and discuss the basic and derived security requirements where SolarWinds products can help. Basic security requirements are high-level requirements where derived requirements are the controls you need to put in place to meet the high-level objectives of the basic requirement. SolarWinds has many existing tools that can provide insight into user behaviors that cause issues such as identity and access management, IT asset management, and configuration management tools and threat detection tools. Of course, tools have to be affordable. They have to be easy to implement, provide some type of cross-functional value, and be automated. They also have to be easily to operate and maintain. Now let's take a look at these tools in a little more detail. SolarWinds All-in-One SIEM, or SIM, which way you pronounce it, or Security Information Event Manager, the Log Event Manager combines log management, correlation, forwarding, reporting, file integrity monitoring, user activity monitoring, USB detection and prevention, threat intelligence, and an active response in a virtual appliance that's easy to deploy, manage, and use. We've designed this SIEM to provide the functionality you need without the complexity and cost of most other enterprise SIEM solutions. Now, network performance monitoring at first glance may not be, easy to say that it's a cybersecurity tool, but it is, because NPM will provide the fault performance and availability monitoring, allowing you to quickly detect, diagnose, and resolve network performance issues and avoid downtime with network optimization software, but also identify any anomalies. Somebody's doing an attack, you're going to see a rise in network traffic. So it definitely will provide you that information. In addition, there's a specific feature called NetPath, which provides a hop-by-hop analysis along a critical path that displays not only performance data, but also traffic, configuration, and details of the devices and applications that are on-prem. It could be in the cloud or across a hybrid environment. And of course, it also supports customizable topology and dependency-aware intelligent alerts. It also does auto-discovery of your network. We talked about identifying assets. Well, this is one tool that will allow to do that using dynamic network discovery and mapping. You can also automatically, after you've discovered this automatically, you can map devices, performance metrics, link utilization, and even wireless coverage. And of course, there's automated capacity forecasting and alerting tools built into the module. Now, the Network Configuration Manager, or some people refer to it as NCM, can help save time and improve network reliability and security by managing configuration changes and compliance for routers, switches, firewalls, and other network devices. NCM audits devices or device configs for things like NIST-FISMA, DISA-STIGs, PCI, HIPAA, SOX, and quite a few other compliance reports. NCM will automatically identify iOS devices with potential vulnerabilities. It utilizes the NIST CVE repository and the National Vulnerability Database, and even provides the tools to manage the investigation, remediation, or waiver of each of those vulnerabilities. And that's probably our most popular tool with our DoD folks. Now, of course, patch management is very important. The SolarWinds Patch Manager makes it easy to perform third-party patch management across tens of thousands of servers and workstations, and enables you to leverage and extend the capabilities of your Microsoft WSUS or SCCM servers to report, deploy, and manage third-party patches, as well as Microsoft patches, of course. Now, this really becomes so critical when it comes to identifying insider threats, because the SolarWinds Access Rights Manager is designed to assist IT and security admins to quickly and easily provision, deprovision, manage, and audit user access rights to systems, data, and files so they can help protect organizations from the potential risk of data loss and data breaches. By analyzing user authorizations and access permissions, you get visualization of who has access to what and when they accessed it. With just a few clicks, customized reports can be generated to demonstrate compliance with most regulatory requirements. You can provision and deprovision users using role-specific templates to help assure conformity of access privilege delegation and alignment with security policies. Now, we also have something called the Server Configuration Monitor, or SCM. It is designed to detect, track, and compare system and application changes in your environment. It's built on our popular SolarWinds Orion platform, where all of our other modules reside. And by using this, you can gain system change visibility in a unified and full-stack monitoring experience. You'll be able to quickly pinpoint the root cause of a problem by easily comparing configuration changes over time and correlating them with performance metrics. Not only is SCM a powerful system administrator tool, but it's affordable with an easy-to-understand node-based model. Now, once again, let's summarize the insider threat flow response process. You have to know and protect your critical assets, and we talked about right in the beginning. You have to develop a formalized insider threat program. You have to deploy solutions for monitoring employee actions and correlating information from multiple data sources. You have to, of course, clearly document and consistently enforce policies and controls. And last but not least, and it's been said throughout this entire webinar, we have to incorporate malicious and unintentional insider threat awareness into periodic security training for all employees. And with that, I'd like to hand it back over to Don.
Thanks, Omar. So I think we can see that this is a comprehensive program that requires a comprehensive solution, both from a human standpoint, because ultimately an insider that's behaving badly, either by intent or by mistake, is a human behavior problem. And so we need human behavior responses at an administrative level, at a business process level, policy level, but we also need technology to leverage and be a force multiplier for those efforts. So with that, I think we can close out, and I want to thank both Omar and Arun for their participation.